There's a house at the end of Maple Ridge Road that most people drive past without a second thought. It's weathered and small, with chipped paint the color of faded cream, and a garden that long ago surrendered to wildflowers and weeds. But if you looked closely at the window facing the road, you might have seen him there. An old man, sitting at a wooden desk, staring at something you couldn't quite make out from the street. His name was Henry Caldwell, and for 50 years he had been keeping a promise to himself. On that desk, beneath the layer of dust that had accumulated like snow, sat a single envelope. It was yellowed with age, the corners soft and worn from decades of existence. The handwriting on the front was elegant, careful. Just his name, Henry. Nothing more. No return address, no date. Just his name, written in ink that had faded from black to a ghostly brown. Henry was 86 years old now. His hands shook when he poured his morning coffee. His knees protested when he climbed the 3 steps to his front porch, but his mind was sharp, painfully sharp, sharp enough to remember every detail of the day that letter arrived. It was 1975. He was 36 years old then, with dark hair and strong hands and a heart that still believed in the goodness of people. The letter had come on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a postal worker who had no idea she was carrying a piece of dynamite wrapped in paper. Henry had recognized the handwriting immediately. It belonged to Thomas Webb, his closest friend, his brother in all but blood, the man who had destroyed his life just 6 months earlier. The betrayal had been absolute. Thomas had been his business partner, his confidant, the godfather to his children. They'd built a furniture company together from nothing, working side by side in a cramped workshop that smelled of sawdust and varnish. They'd laughed together, dreamed together, planned futures that intertwined like the grain in oak wood. And then Thomas had testified against him in court, had stood up in front of a judge, a jury, and a gallery full of neighbors and strangers and told lies. Lies that cost Henry everything. His reputation, his business, his wife who couldn't bear the shame, his children who were too young to understand and too hurt to forgive. He'd become a ghost in his own town, invisible to people who once shook his hand and invited him to Sunday dinners. So when the letter arrived, with that familiar handwriting spelling out his name, Henry felt something cold and hard settle in his chest. An apology. It had to be an apology. But he wasn't ready for it. The wound was too fresh, too deep, still bleeding in ways that no one else could see. He made a decision that morning, standing in his small kitchen with the envelope in his hands. He'd keep it, but he wouldn't open it. Not until he could forgive. Not until the rage that filled his lungs every time he breathed had finally burned itself out. Not until he could look at Thomas's words without wanting to tear them to pieces. He placed the envelope on his desk and told himself, "When I'm ready, I'll know." Days became weeks, weeks became months, months became years. Henry watched the seasons change through that window. Spring brought dogwood blossoms that reminded him of his daughter's communion dress. Summer brought heat that made the envelope curl slightly at the edges. Fall brought leaves that covered his small yard in copper and gold. Winter brought silence, deep and heavy as snow. He built a life around that letter, a small life, but his own. He took odd jobs, Carpentry work mostly, because his hands remembered what his heart tried to forget. He was good at it, fixing things for people who didn't know his story or didn't care. He kept to himself, spoke when spoken to, smiled rarely. People in town eventually forgot why they'd been avoiding him. The scandal faded into history, replaced by newer dramas, fresher gossip. Some people even began to like him again, this quiet man who could fix a broken chair leg or rehang a door that wouldn't close properly. But Henry never forgot. Every morning he sat at that desk and looked at the envelope. Every evening he did the same. It became a ritual, a meditation, a kind of prayer without words. The letter was always there, asking a question he couldn't answer. Are you ready yet? The answer was always no. 10 years passed. Henry's hair turned gray. He'd heard through the thin web of small-town gossip that Thomas had moved away somewhere out west, Colorado maybe, or California. The details were vague, the way details become when people stop caring about the truth and start inventing stories to fill the silence. 20 years passed. Henry's back began to ache from decades of bending over workbenches. His hands developed arthritis that made cold mornings particularly cruel. He'd learned that his ex-wife had remarried, that his children had children of their own, grandchildren he'd never met, lives that continued without him, like a river flowing around a stone. 30 years passed. Henry became old. Not elderly, not yet, but old in the way that settles into your bones and changes how you see the world. The anger that had once burned hot had cooled to something harder, something closer to stone. He no longer dreamed of confronting Thomas. He no longer imagined the conversations they might have had. The betrayal had become part of him, like a scar that aches when it rains. 40 years passed. Henry's doctor told him to take it easy, to watch his heart, to stop lifting heavy things. He ignored most of the advice. What else was there to do but work? What else was there but the quiet rhythm of sandpaper on wood, the smell of oil soap, the satisfaction of making something broken whole again? If you like emotional true stories like this, make sure to like and subscribe. Comment below your story. I read every single one. 50 years passed. Henry was 86 years old, and he woke up one morning knowing something had changed. He couldn't explain it. There was no revelation, no sudden clarity, just a feeling, soft as breath, that told him, today is the day. He made his coffee the way he always did, 2 spoons of sugar, a splash of milk that had started to turn but wasn't quite spoiled yet. He carried the cup to his desk with hands that trembled more than usual, although whether from age or anticipation he couldn't say. The envelope sat where it had always been. 50 years of dust had turned it almost gray. The adhesive had long since dried and cracked. It would take almost nothing to open it now. Just a gentle pull, and the seal would break, like a promise finally kept. Henry set down his coffee. He picked up the envelope with both hands. The paper felt fragile, as though it might crumble at his touch. He could feel his heart beating in his chest, slow and heavy, each pulse a small earthquake.
He had imagined this moment countless times over the decades. Sometimes he imagined finding words of genuine remorse, an explanation that would make sense of the senseless. Sometimes he imagined finding excuses, justifications, the kind of self-serving apology that makes things worse instead of better. Sometimes he imagined finding nothing at all, just blank paper, a joke played by a man who had already taken everything else. With a breath that felt like his first in 50 years, Henry slid his finger beneath the flap and opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, covered in that same careful handwriting, now faded to the color of weak tea. "Dear Henry," it began, and Henry's eyes filled with tears before he'd read another word. "I don't expect you to forgive me. I don't expect you to understand. But I need you to know the truth before it's too late, even if this truth comes too late to matter. I didn't want to testify against you. God knows I didn't want to. But they gave me a choice, Henry. They told me what they'd found, what they'd discovered about your father. Your father was involved with people you never knew about, dangerous people, people who used your trucking business to move things that should never have been moved. I don't know how much he knew, how much he was complicit in, but the evidence was there. Bank records, shipping manifests, testimony from men who were facing prison time and looking for someone to blame. The prosecutor came to me privately. He told me they had enough to charge your father, but your father was dead, so they were going to charge you instead. They'd make it look like you'd inherited more than just his business. They'd paint you as the next generation of a criminal enterprise. Unless I testified that the improprieties in our company were all your doing. Unless I gave them a smaller fish to fry and let them close the case without digging into your father's past. I thought about telling you. I swear I did. But if I told you, you would have fought. You would have defended your father's name. You would have demanded a full investigation. And that investigation would have destroyed more than just you. Your mother was still alive then. Your sister was married to the mayor's son. The scandal would have consumed your entire family, everyone connected to your father's name. So I made a choice. I lied. I took the blame for things I didn't do and placed it on your shoulders, knowing that it would cost you everything, because the alternative was something worse. I saved your father's reputation by destroying yours. I saved your family's name by making myself into Judas. I know this doesn't make it right. I know this doesn't give you back what you lost. But I need you to know it wasn't malice. It wasn't greed. It wasn't betrayal for the sake of betrayal. It was the only way I could think of to protect you from a truth that would have buried you deeper than any lie. I'm sorry, Henry. I am so sorry. I've been sorry every day for 36 years. I'm sorry I took your life from you. I'm sorry I didn't trust you enough to let you make the choice yourself. I'm sorry I played God with your fate. I'm leaving town. I can't stay here anymore. Can't walk past your house and see you through the window and know what I've done. I don't expect you to ever forgive me. I'm not sure I deserve forgiveness, but I wanted you to know. I needed you to know. I'm sorry. Thomas. The letter fell from Henry's hands and drifted to the desk like a leaf in autumn. 50 years. 50 years of anger, 50 years of isolation, 50 years of building walls around his heart and refusing to let anyone climb over them. 50 years of seeing Thomas Webb as the villain in his story, the betrayer, the serpent in his garden. And it had all been wrong. Henry's breath came in gasps now, his chest tight with something too big to name. Thomas had sacrificed himself. had taken the role of traitor to keep Henry from learning that his father, the man he'd idolized, the man whose approval he'd spent his entire childhood seeking, had been involved in something dark and dirty and criminal. Thomas had known that truth would destroy him, had known that Henry would have fought to clear his father's name, would have dragged every skeleton out of every closet, would have chosen his father's honor over his own survival. So Thomas had lied, had stood up in court and committed perjury, had accepted the hatred of the one person's opinion most important. And Henry had never known, had spent half a century hating a man who had loved him enough to become his villain. The tears came then, hot and bitter, streaming down Henry's weathered face and dropping onto the letter below. Each tear left a mark on the old paper, small dark circles spreading like bruises. "I'm sorry," Henry whispered to the empty room. "Thomas, I'm so sorry." But Thomas was gone. Henry had heard, maybe 20 years ago now, that Thomas Webb had died. A heart attack, sudden and final, in some small town in Colorado. He died alone, as far as Henry knew. Died still carrying the weight of a sacrifice that no one had ever acknowledged. Henry sat at his desk as the morning light stretched across the floor, turning the dust motes into tiny stars. He thought about all the years that had passed, all the moments he could have let go of his anger, all the times he could have opened this letter and learned the truth. He thought about forgiveness, and how it's really not for the person being forgiven. It's for the person doing the forgiving. It's the key that unlocks the prison you've built around your own heart. With shaking hands, Henry picked up the letter again. He read it once more, slowly this time, letting each word sink in like rain into parched earth. And then, in a voice barely louder than breath, he spoke the words he should have said 50 years ago. "I forgive you." The room didn't change. The sun continued its slow arc across the sky. The house remained old and weathered and small. But something inside Henry shifted. Some weight he'd been carrying for so long he'd forgotten it was there. He folded the letter carefully and placed it back in its envelope. Then he stood, his knees protesting, his back aching, and walked to the small fireplace in his living room. He didn't burn the letter. Instead, he placed it on the mantel, next to a photograph of two young men with their arms around each other's shoulders, laughing at something the camera couldn't capture. He'd kept that photograph hidden in a drawer for 50 years, unable to look at it without feeling rage. Now he looked at it and saw what he should have seen all along. Two brothers, two friends, two men who loved each other enough to make impossible choices. Henry made it himself another cup of coffee. He sat in his chair by the window and watched the world go by. He thought about calling his daughter, whose number he'd found but never dialed. He thought about walking into town for the first time in years, maybe stopping at the diner for breakfast. He thought about all the things that could have been different, and all the things that couldn't be changed, and all the things that still might be possible. Outside, the world continued, but inside that small weathered house at the end of Maple Ridge Road, something had finally come to rest. Forgiveness, Henry learned, doesn't erase the past. It doesn't give you back the years you lost or the people who are gone. But it does something else, something equally important. It lets you finally breathe. Comment below your story. I read every single one.